On today's podcast, we sit down with industry heavyweight Dan Goldberg, a strategist and brand builder who's been on the front lines of the music merch business for years. Dan has worked with artists who turn merch from an afterthought into a powerful cultural force, transforming t-shirts and vinyl into fandom, community, and identity. We dive deep into how merch is shifting from simple sales to world building, why casual fans can become super fans, and the biggest opportunities artists are missing right now. From standing out in a crowded market to building trust and lasting brands, this is one conversation every artist, manager, and music entrepreneur needs to hear. Insiders, are you ready? Welcome to MUBUTV's Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage artists and music business professionals who are dedicated to having a successful career in the new music industry. Here are your hosts, Ritch, Esra, and Eric Knight.
Welcome back, Insiders, to another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. On today's episode, we're diving deep into one of the most powerful, yet often misunderstood pieces of the music business, merchandising. Joining us is Dan Goldberg, renowned strategist, brand builder, and hardcore scene veteran who has been on the front lines of redefining what merch means for artists and fans alike. We'll explore how merch has evolved from a simple afterthought to a culture-defining force that builds artist identities, fandom, and community. Dan shares his insider perspective on why collectibles like vinyl aren't just music formats anymore, but badges of belonging, and how every artist, new or established, can leverage merch to tell their story and grow a passionate fan base. We talk world building, the secret to turning casual listeners into superfans, the importance of creative cohesion, and why building community trumps chasing hype every time. Whether you're an artist manager, creative, or just curious about the future of music culture, you don't want to miss this insightful and actionable conversation with Dan Goldberg. Stay tuned. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hey Insiders, ready to crush it in the music world? Whether you're an artist, band, or future music biz pro, MUBUTV's personalized coaching is your secret weapon.
We'll work with you side by side, sharpening your songs, building your brand story, locking in your ideal audience, and powering up your social media game.
Starting fresh or ready for the next level, we cover everything: live shows, marketing hacks, branding, all tailored just for you.
Flexible coaching packages let you decide what fits your time and budget. Single sessions or discounted bundles that make investing easy.
Imagine the boost after just one session: clearer goals, smarter strategies, and unstoppable confidence. Get started with a free 15-minute discovery call at book.mubutv.com. That's book.mubutv.com. Let's make your music career unstoppable. Hey Insiders, are you ready to take serious control of your music career? Whether you're dreaming of getting signed, finding the perfect artist manager, or landing your music in movies and TV shows, MUBUTV has you covered with 3 essential free guides.
First, learn how to contact A&R the right way. The insider secrets to approaching executives without burning bridges and with confidence.
Next, discover how to attract the right artist manager, when to start looking, what to expect, and how to find someone who truly believes in your vision.
And finally, unlock the world of sync licensing with how to pitch to music supervisors the right way. Get your music placed in film and TV, reach new audiences, and open up exciting revenue streams.
These guides are packed with real-world advice, practical steps, and the do's and don'ts every artist needs.
If you're listening on this podcast or watching on YouTube, just check the description below to download your free copies now. This is your blueprint for turning dreams into reality. Don't miss out.
Hi, this is Paul Kohler, co-founder of Tandem Management and drummer of Silverstein, and you're listening to the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.
Welcome back, Insiders. Today's featured guest is Dan Goldberg, renowned strategist and brand builder. This was such an important conversation. I am so glad, we've been wanting to have him on the show for a long time, and it never worked out scheduling wise, and we were finally able to get him on the show, and I'm so glad that we did. You know, one of the things that I thought was so important is in this conversation, what he revealed, which I thought was so important, is how merch is not just something you buy after a concert.
Right.
It's not just an afterthought. It's really a whole symbol of identity. It's really a whole element in, serving as a symbol of belonging, telling others what you stand for and your community. And it's a way of building a community as well, for an artist. And you can look at different scenes, whether it's in hardcore or in metal or in hip hop, and, the merch and the things you wear, and not even all clothing items, but they are all part of that community. And I think that was a very important distinction in terms of building an audience connection with you and your fans.
I couldn't agree more, Rich. And one of the other areas that kind of touches on your point is the cultural shift in merch. Physical merch, especially vinyl and collectibles, which we were just talking about, has become a cultural handshake and marker of fan identity, not just a promotional tool. He talks about it. We talk about this thing when you see somebody wearing merch, and I think I kind of mentioned it, it's almost a badge of honor. And it's an identifying marker of what, values you hold. Again, getting back to the whole thing of what a fan is listening for, what they believe in, what the artist believes in, what they believe in, does it match? And so I think that merch has become something that is going hand in hand with that whole cultural revolution.
I completely agree. And I think that we're seeing more and more and more of that with more artists. And the ones who are really smart get that concept on a cellular level.
And with that, insiders, sit back, relax, and enjoy our featured conversation with Dan Goldberg.
Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're talking about one of the most, I think, powerful yet misunderstood parts of the music business, which is merchandise. And, I think for decades, merch was seen as an afterthought. It was something you picked up on your way out of a show. But over the last 10, 15 years, it's become much more than just product. In your estimation, you've been on the front lines of this business for a long time. What role does merch play in an artist's career? And does it vary from artist to artist?
So I'll start with the second part of the question. Yes, it definitely varies from artist to artist. And I think you actually sort of articulated it quite well, where I think in the earlier days of merchandising, and by earlier, I mean, let's say pre 15, 20 years ago, it was definitely an afterthought. And I think in some ways you could maybe say it was somewhat similar to touring, which was it was mostly viewed as a marketing angle to drive album sales. And when there was disruption in the industry and sort of let's call it the post-download pre-streaming era, when entities, whether that was labels or otherwise, wanted to get into various other aspects of business and leaned into merchandising, I think you saw a shift, not just in the prioritization, but more culturally as well. And merch went from being something that was more of a marketing exercise to something that was more cultural, let's just say. And I think in some ways, when done right, merch is it's a bit of a handshake in that it's the interaction between a fan and an artist, and it could set the tone for an artist's career in terms of the story that they want to tell. And obviously, I've built my career on this, so I'm pretty bullish about it. But I'm pretty confident that merchandising, physical product, and probably vinyl will be the last pieces of physical fandom associated with music, at least in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, vinyl is an interesting one, because one of the things that I find fascinating about vinyl is it used to be a format. You and I grew up in a world where vinyl was a format, and now 50% of vinyl purchases, from what I understand, are merch. They're like souvenirs. They buy it from people that don't own turntables.
Right. I actually, it's interesting because I've actually heard higher numbers on that as well.
Perhaps they are higher now. Yeah.
It's all a little bit speculative, but I think what it's showing ultimately is it's a collectible, and it's something that people want to display. And I think more than ever, fans want to display their fandom. And I'm pretty passionate about that. There's a lot of other industries that the music industry could learn from, whether that's sports, culture, gaming, otherwise, where they're really sort of leading into fandom. And I do think, based on the percentage that you mentioned, there's a huge opportunity just in the collectible space. And back to your initial question, I think merch has historically been viewed as black t-shirts. That's not how I view it, right? I view it as more broader, and there's a collectible aspect, there's a memorabilia aspect, and there's all of these various product extensions and brands that can be built in and around the artist. And I do think vinyl is, and it kind of saddens me a bit to your comment about how we grew up with it as a format, but I think it's increasingly becoming more of a collectible piece and a memorabilia piece, which does really, in my opinion, highlight just the excitement that fans have around displaying their fandom.
Very much so.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's really great to have you. I wanted to ask you, you grew up in the hardcore scene where merch and community went hand in hand, and identity often came before money, yet merch still sold. What elements are important when it comes to building fans through merch? I
mean, I actually think identity, to your question, is actually a very important one. And I think in some ways what was beautiful about the hardcore scene was that it taught everyone that merch wasn't a transaction. It was a lifestyle. And the shirts or the product that people were wearing, they were sort of like passports. They told people where they were from, and they told other people where they were going and what you believed in. And I think in some ways it's a vehicle for identity and belonging. And I think what's amazing about the hardcore scene is belonging is not only is it natural to that community, belonging is the product, I think, in some ways. And I'm pretty bullish on focusing on a bit of casual fandom in terms of the path to super fandom, but hardcore bands were doing that instinctively. They created these worlds that felt exclusive, but accessible if you got it. And I think in some ways hardcore could be viewed as a blueprint and a uniform for broader fandom and broader merchandising in general, because it was never the product. Merch was never about product in the hardcore community. It was more of a uniform. And I think once you get into sort of that cultural element and that community element, and I talk a lot about sort of world building, it's a uniform, it's identification, it's belonging, it's who you are. And I think that community first piece is in some ways what's missing today from more artists. But I think hardcore bands sort of created worlds that casual fans could just kind of step into naturally.
Yeah, it's almost like a badge of honor too, I would say.
Yeah. I think in some ways it is. And, as somebody that is closer to 50 than 30 at this point, and anyone that sort of came up through that scene still kind of defines themselves as kids, right? Like we're all sort of hardcore kids, because right. I think we learned these principles and these ethics and these ways to operate that I really do believe could be a blueprint for the larger industry as a whole.
Yeah, very much so. And it's so interesting. As I was listening to you speak right now, I'm reminded, when you said, like, you think of, we still think of ourselves as kids. What's fascinating to me is I reflected on that statement you just made as when I was growing up, we just thought, and I'm a lot older than you, but when I was growing up, I thought, the music that we were listening to, that was just the music of the day, the new Led Zeppelin, the new Joni Mitchell, the new, whatever. It was just right. The music of the day. We had no idea, to your point, that music would have such profound cultural impact and last over 50 years. Like when we were growing up, we weren't listening to stuff 30, 40, 50 years previous, like kids are today, who, the 15-year-old is, wearing that T-shirt of Black Sabbath, is wearing the Dark Side of the Moon T-shirt, is wearing Andy Warhol's, the Velvet Underground banana. It's an interesting kind of thing, to your point about identity, culture, and just the lasting impact of those, I guess, that history.
I agree with you. And I wonder how much of it, to your point, in the era in which you grew up in, was those relics and artifacts and ability to display your fandom were probably not as commonplace then as they are now, right? And I think for newer artists or people in the space that are developing artists, I think you sort of want to design your worlds and the way you're developing yourself for this almost future nostalgia, because Eric, I wonder how much of what you just said was, yes, maybe culturally it was different, but also commercially, those things didn't exist. Versus now, where it'd be more abnormal for artists to not have merchandise or a web store or all of these things, where even 15 years ago, not every artist had web stores. Now they do, right? So because of that, the ability to display your fandom is easier than ever. In some ways, you can make that same argument that it's harder to cut through because it's easy to just put up product and make it sort of cookie cutter, and it's probably harder to cut through the noise associated with it. But that's sort of the beauty and the curse, I think, of the era we're living in. You can make that same argument maybe for, digital distribution and just sort of the cost and the ease of creating music today and to distribute it. In some ways it's easier than ever. In some ways it's harder than ever to cut through.
Yeah, it is easier than ever. But the problem is you have a different challenge today, and that's bringing attention to it. Let me ask you something. Based on what you were just saying, Dan, how can artists today make merch about belonging and about world building, not just about sales? What are some of the things that you feel are important?
I think in some ways it's really lean into who you are and be vulnerable and don't do things that feel like a cash grab. And I think a lot of times fans will be able to see through when a product, multiple products, a quote unquote drop was cooked up in a marketing meeting versus something that's not intuitive, something that's more intrinsic to who the artist is. So I think culture building merchandise moments, they feel as if they were pulled out of the artist's diary, not out of, the product manager at the label or the brand manager at the merchandise company. And the biggest wins are sort of when that merch is an extension of the narrative and not just a logo slapped on a blank. So in some ways, I feel like probably what I'm getting at is the difference is intention. If there's intention behind it and that intention ties to who the artist ultimately is, I think that's the way you do it in the most natural way. So it doesn't feel like a cash grab. It doesn't feel transactional, because I think fans sort of smell that a mile away, versus when it's an extension of the artist's story and not just an afterthought. So, like you were talking before about how times were different when you were growing up. When it's done right, merchandise becomes a collectible. It becomes a piece of history. It's not just a T-shirt. And I think a lazy or unintentional drop or something that's just going to be about tying to an album release and nothing more, it doesn't instill that belief that fans have in an artist, and it feels short term. And not every fan sees through it, but I think a decent amount will see through it.
Yeah, indeed. Dan, you've highlighted artists such as 21 Pilots who have aligned their creative director across packaging, merch, and tour assets for a unified vision. How critical is this kind of creative cohesion for new artists in building a world that fans actually want to step into?
I wouldn't say it's critical, but it's definitely important. I'm conscious of the fact that not every artist, especially those that are coming up and new, can afford to do that, can afford to have a creative director. But cohesion is everything. And back to what I was saying before, when you think about designing merchandise and how you're going to sell that, if that's in a cohesive storytelling way with the color palettes of an album or the stage design or the way that the artist looks on stage and it's all connected, it makes it feel like the merch is not just a product, but more like almost a touch point, and everyone's kind of selling the same, or not selling, poor choice of word, is sort of more telling the same story. So I don't know if I'd say it's crucial or critical, but I think it's important. And I think that cohesion and that same storytelling aspect does matter a lot. But I'm also conscious of the fact that not everyone can afford to hire a creative director as they're just sort of developing themselves. Yeah,
precisely. Dan, I want to touch on something. These days, a lot of artists are leaning on apps and data to build super fans. But, you've said that it really comes down to community first. And my question is, how do you think artists should mix the tech side with the more human grassroots side of merch and fan building?
Well, I definitely think there's a intersection between the two, and by no means am I anti-technology. I'm very pro-technology.
Yeah.
I just think that apps alone and technology alone are not going to just build fandom and super fandom. I think in some ways maybe it makes it easier, and having access to direct contacts with your fans via technology makes it easier to monetize them. But I'm a big believer in, to your point, community over tech, right? I don't think they're necessarily at odds with each other, but I do believe that if you focus in a zero-sum world, both time and money, focus on building community, that community will ultimately lead to that sort of super fandom. It becomes the bridge. And I've sort of said this, I think just doubling down on the super fans is a bit of a short-term strategy. And if you look at the artists that have tried to build communities, whether that's, 21 Pilots is a good example, the Grateful Dead is a good example, Tyler, the Creator, is a good example. And then if you even look at other industries outside of music, because I'm definitely big on, we can be learning from other industries and not just limited to our own innovation or lack thereof. If you look at the consumer space, if you look at, what Patagonia does in terms of building community around environmental activism and how that ultimately drives product and brand experience and things of that nature. You can look at the food and beverage industry, and, Liquid Death has made water cool, which I don't think had ever really been done before, by building community and leaning into, in some ways my upbringing, leaning into hardcore and metal and punk and things of that nature. So I'm just big on community in general. But back to one of your earlier questions, it can't be artificial, because fans will see that through that. It has to be in a very authentic way. And in some ways, you sort of have to play the long game, and you have to treat it like a long-term project and not a one-off situation. But identity matters, community matters. And in some ways, great merch isn't just about what it says about the artist. It's about, if you're a member of that community, what it says about the fan. And I think, my one-liner would probably be community over commerce if you had to choose the two. Yeah. Between the two, because I think one will ultimately lead to the other versus the other way around.
Hey, insiders, we hope that you've been enjoying our featured conversation. Stay tuned, because we've got so much value coming your way. But before we dive back in, a word from our sponsor. Hey there, insiders. Are you dreaming of making it big as a musician, artist, or industry pro? Well, at MUBUTV, we offer personalized coaching to help you turn that dream into reality.
Think of us as your personal guides, helping you polish your songs, craft your story, find your fans, and grow your social media like a pro.
No matter where you are in your journey, we've got the tools and strategies to take you higher. From live gigs to branding and marketing, our coaching is all about you.
Choose what fits your budget, from single sessions to value-packed bundles.
Start with a free 15-minute discovery call today at book.mubutv.com. Your music career is waiting. Remember why you started making music? That feeling of passion, hope, and longing, wanting someone to hear your story?
But chasing success can be confusing. Who do you reach out to? When? How do you avoid mistakes that could close doors?
At MUBUTV, we believe every artist deserves a clear path forward. That's why we've created 3 free guides that cover the essential skills every musician needs.
How to contact A&R executives with confidence. How to attract an artist manager who gets you. How to pitch your music for film and television placements.
These aren't just tips. They're blueprints designed for artists who want more than just dreams. They want results.
If you're listening right now on this podcast or watching on YouTube, look in the description below. Download these free guides that will change how you approach your music career forever.
Don't wait. Your future fans are waiting.
Hi, this is Nick Roth, artist manager at Rare Society. Are you an insider? I am. Subscribe now.
Yeah, it's a great segue to the next question. You know, Dan, you've talked about the middle period where casual fans become loyal ones. How can merch help bridge that gap?
I think it's not unlike what I said earlier. I think in some ways it's sort of storytelling, and how are you using your product for storytelling, and how are you learning from, back to your earlier question, like I think this would be a great example where you could lead into technology and see what fans are reacting to and what sort of, signals are being shown, and is there some cultural literacy from that you could then lean into and make product around and like make merchandising around. Back to what I said earlier, I think if you don't treat them as one-offs and you treat them as more recurring moments, and in some ways this goes back to the earlier question as well, just about, creative and cohesion there, it all feels like you're on some sort of journey. And I do think that kind of middle period of the fan funnel is not focused on enough and is not discussed enough. And I think there's a learning phase in terms of what you're seeing artists react, or what you're seeing fans react to, and how do you lean into that. But the beauty of merchandising, the beauty of product, is you can tell whatever story you want through it. It's easier than ever to make almost anything. And if you see fans are reacting to something, and it's who you are as an artist, you should be leaning into that and testing and learning and listening to the signals and understanding what those signals mean for the fandom. And I think that's when you sort of get into, more of that world building mindset, and people are stepping in and fans are stepping into that middle period world down that hopefully ultimate path of super fandom.
Oh, I absolutely do. I don't think I think, you said it before in one of your answers that it's a journey. It's definitely a journey. And that's just, that's the part of the journey that a lot of people don't focus on. I want to drill down on something a little deeper with you to get into specifics that only somebody with your level of experience could really talk about. You've broken down the math of fan acquisition, spending a few dollars to bring in casual fans with the hope of converting a small percentage into super fans. But my question is, what are the most effective merchandise-driven tactics you've seen that actually make that conversion happen?
I mean, from a data perspective, it's unsexy, but email is still incredibly strong, and doing everything you can to activate and acquire emails, then activate via emails, I would say it really matters. In my career, I was incredibly focused on understanding who the fan in the venue was and how do you acquire that fan for both engagement, but then future monetization. So I became obsessed with this statistic that I believe is still true, which is, generally speaking, the average ticket transaction is 2.7 tickets, which means that even Ticketmaster doesn't know 1.7 people in the room, and that ignores whether or not those tickets are resold. So to your question, I think focusing on who the fan is, understanding their email or acquiring their email, and then marketing them via that, it's not the sexiest thing, but it still performs incredibly well.
Yeah, that's something that we harp on the show with. You better get that email list going as quickly as possible early on in your career.
Crucial.
Yeah. When you look at where artist merch is heading, what do you see as the next big wave of innovation? And where are the untapped opportunities that most artists and teams are overlooking right now?
For me, I'm really big on brand building and building brands in and around artists. And I think you have artists that are doing it, but not enough. Tyler comes to mind with golf and some of his brand building. You obviously have artists that pop stars specifically that have done fragrance lines and sold them recently for, pretty big paydays. But I think building brands in and around talent is a massive opportunity. And I think experiential, and whether that's deeper VIP type experiences, more immersive experiences, and how that could tie together product, merchandising, fandom, and storytelling for maximum impact. Because I think if you believe in this sort of concept that fans, and again, I actually don't think this is specific to music, but fans want to feel like they're part of the artist or the team or whomever's world, how do you build a world around the artist? And I think it's not just black t-shirts. It could be brand extensions. It could be different categories. It could be immersive experiences. And how do you tie them together for maximum impact and storytelling? And if you do that the right way, you build trust and you have and inspire that trust in your fans. And to me, that ultimately is a bigger opportunity than hype. I think hype fades, trust doesn't, and trust is what kind of has brands endure. So I think to your question, it's really more, what are the brand extensions that are broader than just t-shirts that you can do around artists? How do you build experiences, whether that's immersive, virtual, or otherwise, in and around artists, so that you're creating these worlds and these experiences? I think some artists are doing it and not enough. Now, the sad reality is not every artist can be a brand, but way more can than I think are sort of treating themselves that way.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that distinction because, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, that really takes an understanding of who and what you are, getting, your vision, and really giving some serious thought to this. This, the kind of conversation we're having about the kinds of issues in terms of a career are not just, casual throwaway things. They're ongoing journeys. They're things you have to be aware of as an artist. What we do here, what Eric and I do here at this channel is, we're all about educating people about this. And I know that Eric has constantly talked about this whole thing of the identity and building a solid, identity for yourself as an artist, where who you are and what you're about and where you're coming from and what you stand for really are apparent today. And I think so many artists, especially starting out, really don't get that initially. Very few, we find, really get that. So that's an important factor.
I think I was going to say,
yeah,
so
go
I
ahead.
agree with you, right? But identity matters, right?
Yes.
And I think people need to lean into that more.
Yes.
And I think artists, and it's very easy for me to say as somebody that's, operated at that intersection between commerce and art, but not necessarily as an artist since my early days playing in bad hardcore bands. It's easy for me to say that, but identity matters. It's important. And back to, what we were talking about merch earlier, when you get the identity right, great merch it's not just about what it says about the artist. When you have that identity, it's about what it says about the fan as well. And I think that's that's important when artists are trying to lean into who their identity is, that, it's saying as much about them as what it is about what kind of fans they're going to have. So it's something that needs to be focused on, studied, built, but ultimately kind of natural to who they are. Because if you go too far off brand for yourself, fans will figure it out eventually.
No, I completely agree. Dan, I want to ask you something, and this is kind of it's a personal observational question from you to you. Based on your experience, you have worked with hundreds of artists and bands in your career. And what is it that you feel holds artists back in their careers? What have you seen in your experience that does that?
I would say maybe ultimately two things. One is fear, in terms of not necessarily wanting to push themselves as much as they need to be. And then the second one's probably unsatisfying, which is just doing the work. And I don't presume and never think that it's easy for artists to exist in the way that they do, especially today. I think in some ways it was a lot easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it was easier 15, 20 years ago, pre-social media, where, now I think artists have to create content all the time as well, in addition to music and their art. But some of them don't want to necessarily do the work, unfortunately, of everything associated with it. Associated with, I wouldn't even say stardom, but just building real fans. And what I will say is there's definitely a consistent correlation in my career between artists that have achieved, in some cases, the highest level that one can achieve, and them putting in almost all of the work needed to do it. Obviously, there's always going to be edge cases for certain artists that don't, that say no to everything and don't do the radio interviews and don't create content and do that stuff. And, that art sometimes just kind of surpasses everything. But I think in some ways it's doing the work. And I think sometimes artists are afraid to lean into certain things and to try certain things, and maybe in some cases really reveal who they are. And don't get me wrong, like I'm definitely a fan of a lot of artists in music who I don't really know who they are. And their story, the world they're building, is one of secrecy and not really letting people into it. But back to your first question, hardcore was not like that at all. You knew who these people were. You were part of that community. And they were not afraid to be vulnerable, and they were not afraid to do the work of everything associated with how do you create fandom. And I don't think it was intentional with hardcore specifically. I think it's just the way that community was built.
Dan, throughout your life, have there been any books, films, or documentaries that have been particularly inspiring to you that you can help recommend for our audience?
I don't know if I'd have any specific music ones. In terms of more,
they don't have to be music. They could be anything that could inspire you, just personally.
I'm a big fan of the book Essentialism.
That's a great one, McEwen.
Which, I like that a lot. I most recently was given Unreasonable Hospitality by my friend Matt Young, who runs Bravado. I love that one as well. I would say those two, I think, have really sort of helped me think about life and business and mindset versus tactics, and focusing on, specifically in Essentialism, just sort of focusing on like really what matters.
Right.
And, for anyone that hasn't read the book, the basic principle is if three things are a priority, by definition, nothing's a priority. But I think it does focus you a bit in terms of the way you should be approaching not just business, but sort of life as well.
Yeah. Essentialism is a great book. I've read that one. So
yeah. I'm a big fan of Essentialism. I've read it a few times at this point.
Yeah. That's one that you go to like once a year. Yeah.
Is there anything you specifically recommend? Because I think, it's funny, back to your other question in terms of what artists don't necessarily do. One of the things I always look for, in not just artists, right, but for people in my life, whether that's friends or from a hiring perspective, or in some cases artists, is curiosity, right? I think curiosity is just such an important characteristic for somebody. So, and I'd like to think of myself as eternally curious. So based on that, what books do you recommend? Yeah,
I think there's a fabulous book that's along the lines of Essentialism. I don't know if you've read it or heard it. The One Thing. It's by Keller, the guy who does all the real estate. I have it right there. What I forget his name. It's right there, Rich. You see right there, The One Thing. It's right there. You're just touching. Gary Keller. He's the guy who started Keller Williams, which is that massive real estate company. Yeah, real estate, that one I would recommend too. It's along the same lines as Essentialism because it's focusing literally what the title is on the one thing that's the most important thing that's going to, take that first domino and then, knock that one down to the next one, to the next one, and it's a really simple and obvious book. It's like when you read it, you're like, my God, I cannot believe it's such an obvious thing. But when you read it, it's real powerful. So the Essentialism book,
check that one out.
Yeah, definitely check that one out. The One Thing is a really good one that I think I've recommended on the show a couple of times, especially for musicians like me. I'm a musician as well too, recording artist. And, we get stuck in our own worlds and we're kind of, aloof in a lot of ways. And so this helps you really focus on the thing that you need to get done. That's the most important thing. But it's really beautifully illustrated. It's got some really cool illustrations on the things the concepts that he's explaining, but just real obvious. Cool. Yeah, real obvious things. So I would highly recommend, if you liked Essentialism, you'll like The One Thing.
I did. The other one, another book that I generally read once a year is The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter.
I haven't heard that one.
With that.
No.
It's basically just about, which, and I think in some ways kind of ties back to your question with artists and things that are holding them back. the basic principle is just embrace discomfort and learn from discomfort. And basically, how do you put yourself in uncomfortable situations and embrace them so that you can learn from them? And I think in some ways that's sort of, it could be a model for life, but definitely for artistry. And it probably ties back to my answer before about fear.
Yeah. And the other one that I would also recommend too, while we're on the subject of recommending books, is the Daily Stoic. It's kind of like I'm
a fan of the Daily Stoic. And the email the daily email associated with that.
Yeah. So I get that, and I live by that credo of Stoicism, and it's an incredible book. It's kind of like the one that you were just recommending. So it's funny, you and I are on the same wavelength of books.
But for me, it's funny, right? Like I find whether it's like the Easter book or just like Stoicism principles in general, they're aspirational for me.
Yeah, right? Definitely.
Like, I think I probably rarely entirely adhere to them, but it's back to us talking about the fan journey before. We're all on our own personal journey, and Stoicism is definitely aspirational, but something I'm constantly trying to achieve.
Absolutely.
Dan, what is the best way for people to reach you? Is it through your website or through socials?
LinkedIn is fine.
LinkedIn?
My website is really sort of meant to be a catch-all for everything I'm doing. But email or LinkedIn is fine.
Okay. All right. That's great. That's great. Dan, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was a really fascinating and interesting conversation from someone who has really been there and understands the nature of the relationship between, artist and audience. And we really got a lot out of it. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I hope this was helpful and useful.
Very, very helpful. Man, this was a very important conversation. Yeah. I hope all of you out there really got a lot out of this, because the concepts and the things that he was talking about, that Dan was speaking about, are so important in building a career. One of the more fascinating aspects that I thought was so educational to understanding the nature of not only merch, but its role in an artist's career was when he spoke about the hardcore scene's influence. How, he said, I actually think identity, it's actually a very important one. What was beautiful about the hardcore scene was that it taught everyone that merch wasn't a transaction. It was a lifestyle, a vehicle for identity and belonging.
Yeah.
Product that people were wearing told people who they were. Hardcore could be viewed as a blueprint and a uniform for broader fandom. And that is absolutely true. And the other aspect that, and we addressed this in the interview, was the whole thing of, vinyl.
Right.
How vinyl has
growing. Made this tremendous comeback over the last 10, 15 years.
But not necessarily as a format of music.
Correct. It used to be a format.
As a piece of merch.
Right. And that's the big difference. Yeah, one of the other areas that I loved about this conversation was about making merch about belonging and world building. This is something that you and I have been talking about on this show, and a lot of our guests that have come on the show. And what he said was lean into who you are and be vulnerable and do things that don't feel like a cash grab. Fans will be able to see through when a product was cooked up in a marketing meeting versus something intrinsic to who the artist is. Culture building, merchandise moments feel as if they were pulled out of the artist's diary, not out of the brand manager at the merchandising company. Intention matters. And this is the whole idea that you and I have been harping about. What do you believe in? What do you don't believe in? What does your audience believe in? All of those aspects that we've talked about when you're building this avatar of who your fan is, this is one of the steps in that, and the whole world building identity.
Absolutely, Eric. And the other element that's so important is critical, I would say, is that he also spoke, and I think this is a really important aspect for our audience, is the cohesion with all of it throughout your career, your social media, your merch, your album cover. I mean, there should be a cohesion of identity. And I think he, was using the example of a band that used, their main art director for all of that, so that there was that cohesion. Now, that is a luxury that not everybody has, but it is a concept, I believe, that every artist should keep in mind when developing their identity and their image moving forward.
Hey, Insiders, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. To get show notes, links, and everything that was mentioned during this interview, head on over to our official website at MUBUTV.com/podcast/show notes. If you're enjoying the content and what we're doing here on the show, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts from. And don't forget to rate and review our show at iTunes. 5-star reviews are always welcome and help to ensure that our podcast stands out on the top-rated and new and noteworthy charts on iTunes and our space. You can also find us at social media at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter X, all ending with the handle MUBUTV, which is spelled MUBUTV. Don't forget to catch our flagship show, the MUBUTV Music Business Insider video series, airing every week on YouTube at youtube.com/MUBUTV. This show was produced and created by Ritch, Esra, and Eric Knight. Theme music by Disciples of Babylon, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.